name is Aaliyah Turan-Burrell, and I'm the Associate Program Director for our Criminal Justice Portfolio at Code for America. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm so excited to be the moderator for this amazing panel over the next hour or so. The relationship between policymakers and designers and technical advisors is really essential to building equitable policy practices for communities that they serve. And today our panelists are going to be talking about the importance of timing, relationship building, feedback loops, and the ways that agencies and stakeholders can more effectively meet all the groups that they serve. We will be holding 10 minutes at the end of the panel for question and answers. So please actually hold your questions until then. And at that time, you can use the question and answer tab at the right-hand side of your screen to drop any questions that you have for our speakers there. Today we have a really amazing crew of folks. First up is Mike Cowden, who is the Director of Solutions Engineering at Code for America. He's had a 25-year career in technology, working in both the public and the private sector. At Code for America, he works as part of the criminal justice program, helping states both define and implement their technical for automating criminal record clearance. Stevens and Eric Chu are designers and researchers at Nava Public Benefit Corporation. They've both worked with state and federal governments on delivering public-facing and backstage services, and currently they're working with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts on their new paid family and medical leave program. Lastly but not least, Roshan Sethna is a partner at Exigy with experience in organizational leadership, digital innovation, and product. She has guided Exigy's top civic sector clients in implementing user-centered and agile methodologies. Her clients include the Judicial Council of California, San Francisco Unified School District, Center for Effective Public Policy, and the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. She's also led the Exigy team to design and build a digital affordable housing platform that's being scaled across 4 jurisdictions in the Bay Area. And during the course of our discussion, you'll actually hear about some of these case studies that I just mentioned. I want to start actually focusing a question to you, Michaela and Eric. So at Nava, you work with both state and federal agencies to implement programs that affect millions of people. And most recently, you work with Massachusetts to help them roll out their paid family and medical leave program. And you worked really closely with their policy team in the process. Can you talk a little bit about how you strengthen that relationship with the policy team?
Great question. So just for some background here, the Massachusetts paid family medical leave program was actually on a legislative deadline. So we kicked off our work in December of 2019, and we had about 13 months to launch this brand new service for Massachusetts workers. And paid leave is also unfortunately pretty new in the US. So this was also a relatively new policy area to be exploring. And because of this, our team realized how critical it was to bring in the people who best understand the regulations that shape this service from the beginning. So actually, one of the first things we did as we kicked off this work was create a service blueprint with the policy team. And not only did we map out what the end experience would be for people who need leave, but we tracked the underlying regulations and saw how they connected. And doing this really early on, I think it helped our team align on like what we knew, but also what were some of the really big gray areas around the policies, the kind of things that we needed to spend more time investigating together. And once we had made that blueprint, we started to meet with the policy team pretty regularly, and we would just bring them whatever we had. We would bring them flowcharts or just really early wireframes and just show them and ask, does this look right? Does this meet the regulations as you understand them? And we would also share research findings. And it was honestly incredible to see that our policy partners would start to reference those research insights as they were making decisions. So I think that just overall creating this feedback loop early between the implementation team and the policy team set a strong foundation for how we wanted to collaborate. And I think it was really important that we weren't off in a corner somewhere making something. We wanted to bring the policy people into our process, and they also brought us into theirs. I think I would just recommend that if you are working on an implementation team, you're trying to make more upstream changes, try to find the people who know the policies best. They might not have policy in the title, but include them in whatever you can. If you're a designer like me, maybe start by inviting them to a design critique.
Yeah, and what benefits do you see with designers and researchers being closer to that policy process?
I'll take that one. So I promised myself and my team, and like basically everyone at CFA, I wouldn't make this procurement talk, so I won't. But Massachusetts did a big thing by inviting designers and researchers and product teams early enough in the policy lifecycle to where the regulations were still kind of in flux. And that really gave us the opportunity to re-examine the scope of those regulations and the services that it would generate. So, at first, we weren't really sure, how employers would fit into this service and how employers would sort of have their needs met in this legislative deadline. And to scale the effort to investigate employers in this new policy, the team worked with some of our incredible product owners at Massachusetts Digital to spin up a dedicated team to examine that employer experience. And I've been a part of that team for about 10 months now. And as some quick context, when a worker needs to go on leave, they now apply directly through the state. It's not through their employer. So an employer becomes more of a program integrity partner in a sense, essentially assuring that the information that comes through the applications is correct. So like Max said, we've been using pretty basic design tools to help folks in Massachusetts see just how these regulations and policies translate into like technical requirements, as an example, and then how those technical requirements might map to something in the real world in the form of a digital product. And I think a good example of this is when we were working on this employer touch point, essentially when they log into mass.gov to review those applications, those leave requests, they were quickly mocking up prototypes, putting them in front of people again, saying like, this is what you are requiring people to do. And then how does that look to you? Does it actually make sense from your standpoint? We will test this with people, but now you can see what it looks like in the real world. And while this seems like a pretty obvious step for interaction designers and content designers, it's still a pretty divergent method for folks like policymakers. And again, bringing them along in that is so important. We were able to help them connect the dots between stuff like, content that supports their understanding of policy on the external world, and then sort of like what the regulatory requirements require people to do. And so again, on these prototypes, we were able to show just what kind of support we lent to those employers and set those expectations right with the public. Things like, timing, what's on their plate, and the level of resources that employers might seek about these new policies. And that sort of leads to this idea that, like, in my opinion, it's really all about, how are we improving trust with the public through all the touch points that we deliver. And that's just like an omnipresent concept in the civic tech space. But I mean, the policies that the paid family medical leave drafted really assume that, for example, employers just knew what to do. They would simply call the state and then have something done for them. But obviously the new shifting dynamic between employers and workers in the state really beckoned to feedback from folks and gathering the public opinion. So research sprints and usability testing has been a really key part of the process to gathering meaningful feedback to inform that policy rollout and subsequent digital product development.
And just like on that last note, I think that so much of what designers can do on teams like this is really help the people who are tasked with interpreting policy understand what the lived experience is going to be for the people who will use that policy. Another example of this is early on, we did some research with people who had taken leave or had wanted to take paid leave in the past. And we learned from parents who had access to parental leave that they often started this process pretty far in advance, right? Because, I mean, they have a lot of notice. And these parents assume that with this new state program, they would also be able to apply for paid leave early. When we shared this insight with the team, though, we actually realized that there was this gap between what parents expected and how they expected to navigate this service and what the regulations assume parents would do. the regulations say that an application for paid leave isn't complete until there's documentation. So in this case, proof of birth, like a birth certificate. But you don't get a birth certificate until you've actually had the child. And so we shared this gap with the policy and the technical teams, and we brainstormed a way where we could meet parents where they are. We could allow them to apply early, but still satisfy these requirements. And we were able to launch when this program went live this past January. And actually, Massachusetts, by our count, is the first state in the nation to allow parents to apply for paid leave before their child is born. And I think that this just shows kind of the power in these relationships and in this collaboration. We're able to make services that not just work, that aren't just compliant. We can make services that are actually shaped around lived experience and based in the community needs.
Thank you both. That's such a good example of a really unique skill set that is being put to use. I'm curious how the rest of the panel uses their team's skill sets to address challenges in the work, especially relating to how policies either align or maybe misalign.
Yeah, I can jump in here. I mean, I think it's interesting hearing Michaela and Eric talk, because I think the skill set really is around implementing good feedback loops, and that's what like designers and researchers can do. I think traditionally it's been more linear. There are policymakers that create policy, it trickles down to a department or an agency, and the department or agency is tasked with following through on that policy and delivering on it. And that's been a very kind of historically linear relationship. And I think what we're doing as civic technologists with all the skills that we're bringing to the table is turning that into a more circular relationship where there is that feedback loop. And almost, I mean, I see, as someone who's not, on my team, I'm probably the least technical person. I see products as like really great levers for that change, because you can use them as wedges in to say, hey, we're now getting feedback from the product or the prototype or whatever it is. But you have to work really hard, to Michaela's point, to bring those people in the room to create that upstream feedback loop to say, hey, this policy that you created actually is panning out in this really different way. We had the same thing happen. We work a lot in housing. On the housing side, there was a policy that helped people who were already in the neighborhood get preferential treatment to get affordable housing in that neighborhood. So it's kind of an anti-displacement policy. But a lot of people weren't, claiming that preferential treatment. And we saw that very evidently through analytics and through some testing. And so we were curious about, well, why aren't people claiming it? Well, maybe it's because you're calling it the neighborhood resident housing preference, and it's like really complex and no one understands what it is, and they don't know that it would be beneficial to them. So that wasn't actually changing the policy in its entirety, but it was just saying that the way you're delivering this really complex thing is not really working for users. So let's change how we deliver it and make it more friendly for people to understand. So I think just that feedback loop, creating it where it hasn't existed before, even if you create it in really, really small ways with policymakers, is super important.
You bring up the housing work that you all are doing at Exigy. Can you tell us actually a little bit more about that? It's super intriguing.
Yeah, this panel is tackling like 3 really big sector areas with leave and housing and criminal justice reform. So in housing, so the work Exigy has done in housing is targeted at low and middle income affordable housing. So we started working back in 2015 with the city and county of San Francisco on helping basically essentially kind of better manage and deliver on their affordable housing stock. So that housing stock was created by either the city and county kind of funding affordable housing developers, or it was created through policy. So San Francisco has an inclusionary housing policy. That means that any new construction in the city, a percentage of it has to be rented out at below market rate. So they're creating housing stock through different mechanisms, and it was for a variety of end users. It was for seniors, for veterans, for people of certain income bands. So they needed to make sure it was getting to the right people and being leased up fairly. And the process when we onboarded to this project in 2015 was just not great for end users. You had to go in person to each different unit or development and get the paper application for that building, and make sure you had the right one for that building. And then they were really long paper applications. So you had to gather a lot of documents to apply. It usually took several days, all for really a small chance of placement, because San Francisco runs on a housing lottery system. So they'll gather applications, run a lottery, and then, pick through a fair ranking process. And of course, there's more demand than there is actually housing stock. So we built a product called Dahlia. San Francisco named it after their city flower, so it's called Dahlia. But it's essentially kind of a Trulia or Zillow for affordable housing. So you're able to search and apply for affordable housing online. And one thing that we did that was kind of within the confines of what's possible within policy, because there was nothing mandating this, was that we built a common application. So instead of having a different application for each unit or each building in the city, you could use the same application to apply to any unit or building in the city. And that was sort of a small p political process, because we had to get all the housing developers, the city county staff, housing advocates, end users to all agree that this was like a common app that met everyone's needs. And I mean, we user tested and did research every other sprint for probably years building this out. And in that process, we were able to shift, again, programmatic policy. So now Michaela and Eric were talking about more legislative policy. A lot of the policy exegees dealt with is kind of more on the programmatic level within departments. So for example, one of the things that people were collecting in the application process previous to us joining was Social Security number. So we talked to a lot of housing developers, city and county staff, and we're like, okay, what's important about collecting Social Security number? How is it used? And we realized that people were essentially not really using it. It was mostly used as a unique identifier for people's applications, because they wanted to make sure people weren't applying 2 or 3 times to get an advantage in the lottery system, essentially. So we said, great, we can actually design it so that name and date of birth are unique identifiers, and where there's 2 people with the same name or date of birth, we'll flag that for you so you can manually review. And we essentially avoided creating a database of people that have and don't have Social Security numbers. This was pre-Trump administration. And so in our effort to design an application process that was smoother and reducing the application, instead of it being so lengthy, we also were thinking about how can this application be more equitable along the way. So it went from a several day application process to 15 minutes online. You can reuse that application for future housing units that are available as well. And like I mentioned earlier, the preference policies, the policies that are anti-displacement, to say, hey, you actually get preferential treatment in the lottery system if you are from this neighborhood or if you were displaced previously. We were able to humanize those so that people could really understand them and understand, hey, claim this benefit because it actually, helps you in the lottery system. And we could see if those preference policies were actually working or not working. And those are policies that the city and county of San Francisco can create. They've created displacement preferences after groups or communities are displaced from certain neighborhoods. So we're able to help deliver on those policies and show if they're working or not. We built what we built for San Francisco open source, and now we're expanding that work. So we're working with Alameda County, San Mateo County, and San Jose to implement the same thing. We're thinking about, region-wide systems, and we're talking to jurisdictions outside of California as well. One of my favorite things that one of the Alameda County folks said is that this is really helping them understand the affordable housing available in their jurisdiction, and the data from the product can hopefully in the future influence a bond measure, which is like ultimate policy influence. We also want to see more housing stock created, of course, so that more people can get housed. So yeah, that's a little bit about what we're doing in housing and how it relates to both design and policy.
Well, and I mean, I think everything that I've heard so far is fundamentally make government service more transparent for people. Mike, I would actually, I know the work that you do since we work so closely together, but it'd be awesome to hear about how we've been working on this topic.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think one of the things that Roshan mentioned that resonated with me was this idea about simplifying the form down to a unified form, and a lot of the work that we do at Code for America. I think our head of service design mentioned once that in a lot of ways what we're doing is creating more humane forms. And we see this in like our Get Cal Fresh program, where we're providing access to SNAP benefits in California. And we're measuring in a lot of the same ways our impact in terms of time and in terms of time and effort for folks. So seeing processes that go from hours or days down to minutes is really encouraging. And still, it never ceases to amaze me how some really relatively innocuous questions, or at least that sound that way to me, like how many people live in your household, can be really anxiety inducing for folks. And I think it's because once you fill out that form, it's your only voice in a fairly unforgiving bureaucratic process. And at the end of the day, you're still placing that administrative burden on the people that need the relief. And that's a real equity issue because not everybody has the time, money, or resources to navigate the system. So one of the things that we're trying differently in our criminal legal program at Code for America, this streamlined human-centered design process, to just removing the process altogether and giving people direct government relief in the space of criminal record clearance, which is important because it's right now 1 in 3 adults in this country are living with a criminal record, and 50% of children have a parent with a criminal record. And that comes with a lot of serious collateral consequences in terms of access to housing, education, and employment. And the current process puts all of the burden, or at least the bulk of the burden, on the people themselves to figure out the details of their record, file a petition, pay exorbitant fees up to $550 per charge, and then wait an indeterminate amount of time to figure out if they can apply for that job or certification program. And what we've learned over the past 6 years of working in this space is that the petition-based process isn't working for people. It's costly and cumbersome and confusing. And in the end, only 6% of the folks that qualify for relief actually receive it. Because unless you're privileged enough to navigate the system or pay somebody who can, it's just an opportunity that's not available to you. So that's one of the reasons why Code for America chose to focus on automatic record clearance, which we see as a more just and equitable policy for removing the administrative burden on the individual and placing it back where it belongs, on the government that's selling their data to background check companies to begin with.
I'll jump in here and speak for Nava. Like, I mean, we're pretty much light years away from getting automated paid family medical leave. Like, what a dream. But I think it's a good example of like, the work that we've done at Nava to sort of increase the transparency into our process is to make the form as self-evident as possible. I know that like we have a lot of folks who've been working on the workers application for a while. The steps have become so easy that like anyone can do it themselves. That's sort of our goal, is that like we have a 100% success rate for folks to actually use that. And I think the transparency layer that we've experienced in our work is like, you know, how do we inform the content using like real people's words to make that happen? I mean, ideally in projects, you hand the mic to somebody else and allow them to speak, because it's not about like what your synthesis is and how rockstar you are. It's really like, are you actually sort of transposing things into the way that they see it? Sort of like what Roshan was saying with the housing example. I think it's a really good sort of like perspective on how we mold content. And I think this speaks to the way that policymakers sort of gather that public opinion and insight, ask yourself if you're like in the legislature, like, how do you usually gather public opinion? Is it generally through like open comment periods? I mean, that's really cool, but it's not necessarily going to work for a lot of the projects that we've been working on, because you're not testing the assumptions of what these new policy areas and are going to have on the impact on societies and communities that are seeking them the most. So I'd be really curious sort of how that evolves with our sort of like the new policy areas like paid family medical leave in the future. But I sort of on the note, Roshan, you mentioned something earlier about like design work being like a really good skill to have, and that's really awesome. I think on that note, I'd recommend making design work that you do and we do as like democratized as possible, and leveraging and creating templates for folks like your stakeholders to do the work when you're not there in the room. I mean, I'm speaking for myself because I'm a vendor, but like, like Nava's service blueprint tool was a really good thing for our Massachusetts partners to leverage, because when we left, they could make their own service blueprints as well.
Yeah, I'll just add to that 100%. I think upskilling and the way Exig likes to do it as a vendor as well, I think is just working really alongside jurisdictional team members and transferring those skills as we work together. I definitely remember on the housing work, there was a point early on where the team, the jurisdiction kind of said, hey, I think we have this idea to do X, Y, Z, but like, I think we should put it in the backlog to like validate at our next like research session. And we were like, yeah, let's do it. Like we did it together. But to the point in general about forms, I think this is huge. I mean, I think you're seeing the US as a country overall start to like have this aha of like the type of work, Mike, you're doing in terms of why do we need an application anyway? Are there places where we can just eliminate that? I think we're seeing like whisperings of this even at the national level with either rental assistance or the child tax credit or things like that. Like, how can we just get things to people who are eligible for them and not put the burden on them to apply? So of course we want to make the process better. If there is a form, we want to, design it and make it very human-centered. But in the cases where it's possible not to have one, I think it's super exciting just to get benefits in people's hands.
Yeah, and all of this, it speaks to working within the current law, the confines of the current law, and then thinking about new ways of breaking past that current. And Code for America has been working with individual states early in the policy design phase to help draft more just and equitable laws. Mike, you mentioned that earlier. Can you talk a little bit more about that work?
Absolutely. So yeah, Code for America is part of the Clean Slate Initiative, which is a national bipartisan coalition focusing on passing automatic record clearance law and implementing it. We're working directly with legislators and trying to pass laws because we're working fundamentally within a criminal legal system that is unjust and inequitable. And we're trying to make a difference there. We're working within a criminal legal system where Black men are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white man. And 1/3 of all Black men in the country are living with a felony on their criminal record. And there's obviously a lot to tackle in this space, but the thing that we're trying to do is just focus on giving people a second chance, making sure that their interaction with the criminal legal system doesn't end in a life sentence to poverty, because these criminal records have pretty substantial ripple effects that impact most of our basic human needs, and an individual's ability to house themselves, go to school, get a job. All of these things are impacted by a criminal record. And so, as I was mentioning earlier, we're trying to shift the administrative burden for record clearance back on government by automatically clearing all eligible criminal records across the country in different states across the country. And moving from this completely manual process right now with a lot of human review and oversight to automation can be kind of challenging for governments to envision, because it requires trust in technology, acknowledging limitations, defining or even ceding some discretionary authority, or at least creating boundaries around what they're comfortable automating away. And so what we've been doing at Code for America is working with states to create an end-to-end picture of what automatic record clearance can look like in their state. And we spend a lot of time working with the data because that's the fundamental challenge of automatic record clearance. We're working with large sets of messy criminal history data that's often decades old and spread across multiple systems and multiple agencies. And we're trying to bring clarity to that. And by having a technical perspective at the table early in the policy life cycle, we can help them understand where that data lives, how it's structured, and what the limitations are, so that we can more effectively automate eligibility for clean slate and deliver relief to millions of people. And I think in a lot of ways, and the things that I'm hearing from Nava and Exegy as well, is that in a lot of ways, we're coaching government to be more agile. We're defining a minimum viable product for what automatic record clearance looks like in their state, something they can actually deliver. And so far, we're working with about a dozen different states on clean slate policy and implementation. And our work kind of breaks down into 3 pillars. The first of which is passing the legislation. The second is helping with implementation. And then the third pillar is around delivering impact. So we have a team of quantitative and qualitative researchers that are working directly with impacted individuals to make sure the policy meets their needs. And this is particularly important with automation, because we want to make sure that the folks understand how that this is available to them, how they're going to be impacted and how they can benefit from it. And I think this goes back to some of what other folks were saying about this end-to-end life cycle policy, this feedback loop, where in order to be truly equitable, the way we've approached it is to be involved from the pre-policy work with legislators and advocates, through implementation with the state agencies themselves, on to actually working with the communities that need and receive the relief, and having that feedback loop so that we're informing the policy as best as we can. Because there are choices at each of these steps, from writing legislation through implementation, on to educating the public about it. And we have to be mindful of these choices, because each of these choices is a decision to increase or decrease equity. And so what we've learned just from being involved in this early phase of helping draft legislation is it's easier to fix these problems and challenges further upstream. So if we can write law that's informed by the realities of the existing agency systems and data, then we're going to be more effective at rolling that out. And so we try to look at making sure that the law reflects the data the agencies have to work with, and also letting the data inform and educate the policy itself. So a lot of times we actually start with the criminal history data itself, and we model how policy choices are going to impact communities and how they'll do so. So looking at how minor changes in eligibility requirements affect people in real terms. This can also be helpful for surfacing feasibility issues and legal ambiguities that ultimately need to be resolved in the final legislation anyway. And then our data science team works with creating impact analyses to look at the demographic and geographic impact of these different policy choices, trying to make sure that we understand, are we helping the right people? Are we helping the people that need it most? Are we helping the people that the system has been punished by design? I think there's, during the keynote, Mayor Michael Tubbs made a comment about government actively correcting the harms that it itself has created. And I think that's part of creating just and equitable policy. And it gets back to measuring what matters. And that's why I think it's important to have an organization that understands technology involved early in the policy lifecycle, so that you can use actual data to drive implementable and equitable laws laws that we can deliver and laws that are going to deliver real relief to the communities they're intended to serve.
Yeah, and you end point, Mike, around how folks who are often left out of decision making, of input into the policies that are going to impact them. And you all have already touched on this a little bit, but how do you best incorporate feedback from impacted communities into the policy itself?
I can start here, but yeah, maybe Michaela and Eric can also jump in as well. This is such a, I think communities navigating a lot of these services already have limited time. And so you're asking time of people that already have limited time. There's a great publication that Chicago Beyond created called Why Am I Always Being Researched? If folks want to look that up. And I think there's different ways to do it. I think you have to constantly be asking yourself who's in the room and who's not in the room. And one of the ways, at least Exigy has been doing it, is through community leaders and nonprofit organizations. Of course, we talk to end users and we bring them into the process as well, and we co-create designs with them. But they have a lot of trust in their community leaders and folks that are already really embedded in the community. And this is their kind of day-to-day job to engage in that way. So throughout our housing project, we work with Mission Economic Development Agency, for example. We worked with Lighthouse for the Blind. Lighthouse for the Blind is great in the city and county of San Francisco because they actually have a process by which you pay them and for their time, and you interact with them and understand, hey, is what we're building going to work for folks who have accessibility needs? So they have an established process by which you can kind of engage. Because the thing I think about the most is just, are we continuing to overburden people who already have a lot to deal with? And you want to be kind of careful with that. But you also want to make sure everything you're doing and approaching has the people at the table that need to be at the table. I don't know, Michaela or Michael or Eric, if you have others.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to big plus one to everything you just said, Roshan, especially around overburden. I think that is also why it's so important that we do think about best practices. I mean, you're making a form, there's so much already built in that we can extend, and especially a digital form. I mean, things like the US design system is a great way to just make sure you have an accessible components and accessible form from the get-go. And I do appreciate also, Michael, what you're talking about asking are we bringing in the right people? And I think that as researchers, when we think it is going to be valuable to do that end service and so research with end users, we're bringing in the voices and the communities who are maybe most vulnerable, maybe need the most support. We do get access to that room, right? We are bringing insights into the room. And so as researchers, we just need to stop and take a minute and ask, whose voice do we want to lift up? I think tactically, one way that we do this at NAVA is, this is a basic research process, but we use demographic screeners a lot because that is a tool that can help teams see who they're talking to, make sure that we're speaking to not only a diverse cohort, but we're lifting up the voices that we want to be. I mean, one example here, a lot of government work, it comes down to language, right, in clear language. So we often check to see education levels of the participants who are interested in research, because we want to make sure that what we have is accessible to everyone, not just those with advanced degrees.
I'll just add one more thing about this, that it's, Michaela kind of hit on this, but about managing power dynamics. There is inherently going to be a power dynamic in any relationship, and as vendors, as government, wherever you're coming from, you often hold that power. And so I think we need to figure out how we are designing kind of against that in a way. And I don't know if anyone has really figured that out, because government's inherently always going to hold power in that relationship when they're designing services for the public. But I think just knowing that when you walk into a room, there's a power dynamic, and in certain rooms where I walk in, you know, my status as a woman or a person of color might mean that I have less power, but then my status as someone who went to college or as a vendor or whatever might mean that I have more power. So just really understanding those power dynamics in the rooms that you're entering. And then I just wanted to add another thing. Another tactic that we use is also with the housing work. We often would bring in people into the process who were placed into housing and kind of had stabilized a bit. So they weren't, you know, as in emergency mode, kind of running around applying for housing, but they'd actually gotten it and they kind of understood the process by which they got it. And so those folks were actually often advisors to us and kind of helping guide us, because they were essentially kind of more of the power users. So I think there's different things you can do to make sure you're spreading that burden out in terms of like how the system gets designed.
Yeah, the power dynamic is such a key point. I would love to actually turn over to questions at this point. I see there are a number of questions in the question and answer section, but feel free to add more, and we will get to as many as we can in the next 15 or so minutes. And the first question I want to get to is, how did you get the ear of policymakers in the first place? How did you connect to them and get a seat at the table?
Yeah, so I want to like echo what Eric said early on, which is that Massachusetts just like really thought through how they wanted to build a service, and they brought us in really early into the process, which I think helped to just like get these people, because this is kind of a bad answer, but like we asked, right? We were like, listen, like this is a new service. We think that there's a lot of risks here. We also don't have much time. It's going to be really valuable that we talk with the people who understand the regulations best. And they were on board. And so I think that in the project like Massachusetts, we were really successful by just being really clear up front what we thought was going to make this project successful, and how we thought that the policy interactions were actually going to help overall de-risk this launch. I don't know if other folks also want to add to this though.
I think I would also sort of pair it with another question, like, which, Lee, can I do that? I'm going to do that. So there's another question here that's like kind of catching my eye, which is like, how responsive are policymakers to recommendations, especially when there's like red tape kind of involved? I think when you're interacting with folks who do hold the keys to policy change, there are some times where you simply need to understand which battles are worth fighting. And so like, if you're able to demonstrate that certain changes can have very, very wide impacts, sort of like the example that Michaela brought up with understanding, you know, what certification documents would be needed to sort of like complete an application for new mothers. That's a really good example of like where we can show there is a technical capability. We know it's within our scope, and we can show that. When there's certain points where you're going to run into folks who work directly with lines of politicians, and I've seen this sort of like in the chat throughout the panel, is that like there are some ideologies that will be pushed forward no matter what you do. And this is like kind of present in our federal work. Like I've been working with federal agencies for the past 4 years or 5 years, and you can imagine that like there were certain policies that we couldn't necessarily touch through some of the design work that we were doing, not necessarily at NAVA, but there were certain things that we could change. And so understanding where the opportunities were right for us to enhance equity through design is really, really key. You got to have that eye for it.
Awesome. Question about, which is a little bit piggybacking on the how responsive policymakers have been, which is, are there solutions that you can avoid implementing so that government takes the most effective route? So for example, improving the application forms might encourage government to put off the automation work.
Mike, did you want to start?
Roshan, I didn't know if you wanted to take this one.
No, go ahead. Oh, sorry, I'm just unmuted because I'm unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we definitely see this with the petition-based process for clearing criminal records versus automation. Some states have created their own, improved forms for doing the petition-based process, and we don't really see that as really a conflict with automation. I think it's more what we try to understand is a lot of what decisions we have to make about doing automatic record clearance are just not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, making sure that we can cast a wide enough net to clear as many records as we can. But we see that there will always still be a need for a petition-based process and that mostly is because of the data challenges and process challenges that are just inherent in the way that state governments have tracked their information. So I think there are situations where we see one kind of pitted against the other of like creating an online form that allows people to petition for themselves versus automation. But in some ways, I think it's a false dichotomy because you can do both, and the petition-based process is always going to be necessary there, but that doesn't preclude us from having real impact at scale by continuing to push for automation.
Want to jump into?
I actually saw some of the comments early on in terms of feedback loops I wanted to speak to, because I mean, I myself would love to hear if there are other examples that folks know about in terms of policy feedback loops. I'd talked to someone, I think in Redwood City, California, who had said that they were testing out writing into the actual policy that in a year, XYZ metrics need to be tracked, and then the policy needs to be iterated on. So essentially like agile policy making, which I think I've just heard whispers of a few jurisdictions actually trying that. And I thought that was super cool. So if people know of other examples, I saw Matthew had kind of linked the policy lab in the UK as well. But I think there's some cracks in the fact that like people understand that just writing a policy doesn't mean that it's going to be, intent versus impact kind of thing. Doesn't mean it's going to actually have the impact that you want it to have. And so you actually need to monitor that and see if it has kind of negative externalities. One of the small examples of this also, I mentioned, again, inclusionary policy in San Francisco. A lot of cities have this. So every new construction, a percentage of it has to be rented out below market rate. A lot of the users we talked to that got housing in those buildings just had a kind of a hard time because you have a market rate building in one of the most expensive cities in the US. So most of those units are getting rented out at $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month. And then you have a population that gets to rent them out at below market rate. So you have basically essentially what's a mixture of class in one building. And so in a neighborhood that's not necessarily that affordable. So the grocery shops you're going to, the restaurants you're going to aren't that affordable. So it creates a lot of other issues for those families who might be lower and middle income because they're at kind of a dissonance being a part of a community that might not be as accepting to them, or they don't have access to other resources, whether it's healthcare or groceries or whatever it is that are affordable. So there's parts of it, you think kind of inclusionary policy, that makes sense. The percentage of the units like should be, but there's a lot of other things that come with economic development and how you actually support low and middle income families as well. So I think, yeah, I'm super interested in that policy feedback loop conversation. If anyone would love to reach out to me or knows more about it.
Actually, we'll say at the very end, our panelists are going to put their contact information in the chat, or maybe they haven't, I missed it. But so you will be able to reach out and follow up at that point. Next question is, how does the policy research process differ from the design research?
That's a good question. Eric, did you want to start, or I'm happy to chat about it. I've known agencies that have also, like vendors that have also helped kind of inform policies by doing user research. I think the user research, is baseline always helpful if you're chatting with people about their current process or their current issues, and you're just going to be more informed when you're writing a policy or building a product. Either way, I think you'll be more informed. But I think there are probably things that we're used to in the kind of product world that we have to adapt a little bit when we're thinking about policy, since policy has just like a different iterative cycle, a lot of different stakeholders and things like that. So a product in isolation, especially just in the private sector, you look at analytics, you look at, you do user testing, you do these things, and you're able to kind of iterate and go. Whereas, with policy, you're just dealing with different organizations. So in the case of housing, you're dealing with the jurisdictional staff, but you're also working with both for-profit and nonprofit housing developers, housing advocates and counselors, housing seekers. There's just a bunch of different entities, and the policy kind of needs to work for different people. So it's almost this like, you don't want to design by committee, but you're designing this thing that is going to have a lot of externalities in different people's processes. That's one thing I would say. I don't know if others have other ways in which they're different.
Rebecca, thank you so much for clarifying, because I think I was going to take it in a completely different direction. I will say, design research in the way that I sort of understand it in the practice has been more about understanding what needs that we need to sort of build towards to fulfill. Whereas the policymaking research has always been about like understanding like, how does your logic tree work, and like, how is that going to, what steps you need to do to achieve a certain outcome that are sort of predefined by folks in the legislature. I think when it comes to policymakers doing their own research, I think there's a lot of blurred lines. It takes a lot of different hats to inquire something holistically, and I think a policymaking lens is just one hat that you can wear when you look at what people are trying to do in communities. Mac, would you have anything to add to that?
I think we're seeing though that like we're trying to collapse it a little bit, right? I think like we're seeing that like policymakers, right, and they can and insights. Our collaborators in Massachusetts like sometimes come to us with wireframes based on like what they're hearing in town halls with constituents, and yeah, I don't know. I do think that like user research, like it is a tool that I think we should dream that most policymakers add to their toolkits.
I'll also say that I think I don't know if the rest of the panelists would agree with this, so correct me if this is totally off, but I think it's a little bit of a myth that all policymakers are doing this like pure research and creating policy that's super sound and they've like thoroughly researched everything. Policymakers are doing a million and one things. They're also really busy. A lot of policy is written by private sector and ends up finding its way to policymakers' desks. We've been actually asked to like say, hey, what's the type of policy that would create more affordable housing? And we're like, we're a technology company. Like you need to be engaging, like, so yeah, I guess there's a myth there that I think we need to bust a little bit in terms of how policy is actually created and written, and how we can support policymakers who are trying to address like 100 issues at once and in creating sound policy. And often they're dealing with strained staff and capacity and things like that as well.
Hey, when we were doing some like initial interviews with the people who interpret the regulations for paid leave in Massachusetts, I think like I came into that assuming that these people actually wrote it, right? But they didn't write the law. They didn't write the initial regulations. And so they were like, I don't know where this came from. Like we're making a guess for how to best interpret it. And that was like a really big learning moment for me as I as I started to better understand, like there's a lot of different layers to the policy process, and even the stakeholders who are charged with overseeing services might have a different angle and viewpoint.
We have time for about one more question. I know that we didn't get to all of them, but again, I'm hoping that you all will follow up with our panelists to dig deeper into these questions. But last is that for services and products that are long-term and require maintenance, how often do you revisit or re-research constituents' needs to ensure that the product is still meeting them over time?
I think the answer is constantly. We've been working on the housing product for 5 years now. It's still going, it's still growing, it's expanded into affordable home ownership and other programs. So I think it's useful every now and then to step back and do kind of a larger check in terms of like, let's really like talk to a bunch of people and look at analytics and things like that and check to see if the impact that we're having is the intended impact. But I think if you're not integrating it into kind of a weekly, monthly type of practice, you're just going to lose sight of that. And I've actually seen kind of stakeholders step back and fall into this trap of like, oh, but we just need to release a bunch of features and there's all these things we need to do. And like, cool, like temp checking if this is having the impact that we intend is kind of secondary. So I think if you're not doing it on some regular cadence, it can start to feel like it's not as important because you got the initial thing, quote unquote, right. And, you know, it's been a year or two and you haven't checked in yet.
This could be, I think, its own talk, but just to say, like, policy will also change over time, right? And like, we need to be building in flexible ways. Part of that is, yeah, like continuous research and just like knowing that like the policy is going to probably change, right? Administrations might change, and so you have to keep being in check with your constituents.
We have like 30 seconds left, and I do want to make sure the panelists have a second to drop their contact information so that you all can keep in touch and can follow the work that they are doing across the country and just learn more about how to incorporate these learnings into your own work. Thank you all so much for being here, and we will maybe stick around for a minute or two. I don't know whether this kicks us out or not. But as folks are leaving, yeah, it's great to have your feedback. I know that there's a form. Please fill that out. That's helpful for us. And again, thank you all so much for being here and for sharing.